So the base for the mouse droid is a cheap RC car. I just took out all the screws, removed the car body, just leaving the base and the aerial. I then made a paper template for the bottom section of the mouse droid body. All measurements will be in the description of the video. Depending on the size of your RC car, you may need to change up some of the measurements. I then made a solid version using some foam core board. I glued it in place and then gave it a little test drive to make sure the wheels wouldn't get stuck. For the middle section, I measured 1.5 centimeters out from the body on all sides. I cut out the paper template and transferred that to some foam core. You want to do this 4 times and glue 2 of the foam core pieces to each other. Punch a hole through both to feed the aerial through before gluing a small strip of foam core between those 2 pieces. Push the aerial through and mark out where the base should sit before gluing it together. Next are the side panels of the main body. I made 2 of them and attached them 1.5 centimeters from the edge and added in some supporting strips between the 2 pieces. Using 3mm acrylic, I then cut out sections to cover the majority of the droid. That's all the panels at the bottom, strips to cover the sides of the middle section, and all the parts for the main body. I hot glued the acrylic to the foam core and then glued all the acrylic joints together with epoxy. I taped all the parts in place and then waited for it to dry. Before adding the top, I taped the aerial into the back corner of the body so it can be fed through a small hole in the top section of acrylic. These are all the parts of acrylic that I glued onto the foam core. Once the glue had dried, I rounded out all the corners using a sanding tool on my Dremel, and then used some filler and fine sandpaper to fill and smooth out all the gaps. For the side panels, I cut out some craft foam and marked out lines with a 0.5mm gap, and used a screwdriver to make small indents across those lines. On top of that, I just used some spare beads and some more craft foam to create this pattern before covering it in 3 layers of PVA just to seal the foam better. Glued it onto a Lego base and made a mould of this in silicone. You can skip this step if you want and make both sides from scratch, but I wanted my panels to be a solid plastic on the side. I used some casting resin to fill the mould, making sure I filled up all the small gaps left by the beads without any air bubbles. When the resin set, I cleaned up all the edges, sanded down the back, and used some trusty old super glue to fix it to the body. For the parts on the top of the droid, I used some beads, cheap washers, and a pack of screw plugs for some details. First, I made an L shape out of some acrylic before adding washers and some beads on top. I then glued on a random assortment of beads, glued the plugs between the washers, and cut up parts of the plugs to go on the front as well as the bottom to make it stand up on a small strip of acrylic, which was then attached to the top of the droid. Now for the paint. I taped up the RC car and first painted it with a layer of primer, then with a layer of black, and just added some weathering details with silver and a custom red stripe. For a bit more detail on the top, I added some random wires on the front and the back. And I also added my costume group logo on the back of the droid. And there you have a completed drivable mouse droid. In the future I may add sounds to this build so he can make all his little beeps and boops when he's driving about, but for now I'm quite happy having him just to be able to drive. I've also renamed him Phil, and very much looking forward to taking him out on some smaller events, maybe later this year or next year. I hope you've enjoyed this video, guys. My name is Ace Cosplay, and I shall see you in the next one.